A black teen was just trying to board a flight with his mom, but when they passed through airport security, everything changed. A suspicious pouch appears in his backpack. He's pulled aside, humiliated, and accused without proof. But just 12 minutes later, his mother shuts down the entire airport. What she does next shocks the nation and sparks a firestorm no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that like button and subscribe. It all started with what should have been an ordinary trip. There's a particular kind of morning in the South when the air hangs thick with promise, and the sky, broad, blue, infinite, feels like it's watching. In a modest home tucked in the bones of an Atlanta suburb, Ruth Delaney was folding the last of the laundry into a suitcase she'd had since college. The fabric had grown worn with time, like her patience. Her son, Elijah, was late coming down, and she knew that lateness in a black boy could cost more than just a missed flight. 18 years old, Elijah still moved like he had all the time in the world. He shuffled into the kitchen barefoot, sleeping clinging to his shoulders like a second skin. Ruth didn't scold him. She never did. The world would punish his lateness harshly enough. Instead, she slid a plate across the table and gently reminded him to pack his literature book. "I'm bringing Invisible Man," he said, eyes catching hers for a moment. "Good," she replied, pausing with the coffee pot mid-pour. "Just remember, you're never invisible to the ones who want to break you." Their journey that morning was meant to be simple, a visit to see Ruth's sister in Oakland, a summer break before Elijah left for Howard University. It was the kind of trip other families take without fear, without a second thought. But black folks in America have learned not to move that way. There is always a calculus, always an accounting of risk. They rode in Ruth's sputtering sedan. Its AC long gone, but its will still strong. As they approached Hartsfield, Jackson, Elijah watched the planes crisscross above them like arrows of hope. Ruth kept her hands at 10 and 2, her eyes flicking toward the rear-view mirror. It was just another drive, but she'd driven through history, and history doesn't let go so easily. The terminal pulsed with life. Families rushed past, rolling their hopes in wheeled suitcases, clutching coffee, passports, and children. Ruth and Elijah, travelers like any others, moved with purpose. Yet the air shifted the moment they entered. It always does. Security eyes lingered just a beat too long. Conversations hushed as they passed. None of it overt. Nothing said. But everything felt good. "Try to smile, baby," Ruth whispered as they reached the kiosks. "It doesn't change much, but it makes them nervous when you don't look afraid." Elijah did smile, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he understood the choreography of survival. The two of them danced it daily. He tapped at the screen, printed their boarding passes, and adjusted his jacket. Ruth stood beside him with quiet poise. She didn't wear armor, but her posture was steel. It wasn't until they reached the TSA line that the hum began. Not sound, but that unspoken hum, that shift in energy, that ancestral memory that told you, something's coming. The line wound like a snake. Agents barked instructions with that peculiar tone they reserved for the ones who look like Elijah, too young to be dangerous, too black to be innocent. Ruth said nothing. She watched, shoulders taut. She had seen this play before. Not here, but in grocery stores, in school meetings, in banks, in neighborhoods where the windows are too clean and the sidewalks too quiet. The same scrutiny, the same suspicion, the same pretense that their fear is your fault. Elijah removed his shoes, his belt, his hoodie. He placed his prized book in the tray like it was sacred. And to him it was. As he passed through the scanner, Ruth watched a young white mother be waved through without question, her stroller unchecked, her baby babbling nonsense no one would dare interpret as threat. When the TSA officer pulled Elijah's bag from the belt, Ruth's stomach clenched. "Ma'am," he said. "Step aside." Elijah froze. Ruth stepped forward. "That's my son's," she said, already knowing. "Ma'am, step aside." The officer's voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Power rarely needs to shout when the room's already listening. Inside that bag, Ruth knew, were headphones, a novel, a snack. But that wasn't what they were looking for. They were looking for a reason. Any reason. And the moment they found a pouch of white powder, Ruth saw a script written long ago start to play out again, this time with her child at center stage. "I don't know what that is," Elijah said, his voice cracking under the weight of 1,000 false accusations borne by men who looked just like him. Ruth stepped closer. Her voice was calm, but the storm was building behind her eyes. "That's not ours," she said. "You need to test it. Now." The officer hesitated. A test was done. Negative. No narcotics. But still, the questions continued. The looks. The whispers. The supervisors. The double checks. The notepad with a name already circled before she ever spoke it. They were cleared. But not clean. Never clean. Not in their eyes. And as Ruth gathered their belongings, wrapping an arm around her boy who was shaking but trying so hard not to cry, she knew. This wasn't about the powder. This was about presence. About who is welcome and who is watched. And as they stepped back into the current of the terminal, Ruth Delaney's eyes burned not with fear, but with resolve. Because they were going to San Francisco. But first, she had a lesson to teach. And Lord help the institution that thought a mother's love was something you could detain. It's a peculiar kind of quiet that settles over a person when they've been humiliated in public. Not the silence of peace, but the stillness of endurance. A holding of breath. A clenched pause between the insult and the response. Ruth Delaney knew that silence well. It had followed her through school corridors where teachers called her articulate like it was a surprise. It had trailed her in department stores when security trailed her too. And now it sat between her and her son, Elijah, in Concourse B of the world's busiest airport, as they tried to swallow what had just happened. They found a small cafe near Gate 47, just 2 seats by the window, tucked away from the buzz of travelers and the steady march of roller bags. Ruth ordered coffee. Elijah asked for nothing. He just sat, his fingers gripping the sleeves of his jacket like he was trying to hold himself inside it. His voice, when he finally spoke, came soft and careful, as if too much volume might shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy. "Why did they do that, Mama?" Ruth didn't answer right away. What could she say that he hadn't already begun to learn? She reached across the table, placing her hand on his wrist. "Because sometimes, baby, your skin speaks louder than your words." Elijah nodded, eyes down. His shoulders slumped, not from shame, but from weariness. A weariness he had no right to carry at 18, but that had settled on him all the same. Ruth knew that weight too. Knew how it bends a person over time. That was when the second act began. A woman approached. White, middle-aged, her lips pressed thin with the self-importance that came from wearing a lanyard and knowing someone's name in the security office. 2 uniformed airport security officers followed behind her, like punctuation. "Are you Elijah Delaney?" she asked, her voice clipped, practiced. He looked up. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Coordinator Sanderson. We need to ask you a few more questions about your bag." Ruth rose before he could. She stood slowly, deliberately, like someone walking into church. "We already answered your questions." The TSA cleared him. "You had your chance." Sanderson didn't flinch. "Ma'am, this is just a follow-up. Standard protocol." There's that phrase again. Standard protocol. The polished vocabulary of discrimination. The polite mask racism wears in public when it doesn't want to seem too obvious. "This your standard?" Ruth said, her voice low. "To follow a child through an airport because your people planted something and couldn't make it stick?" One of the officers, a younger black man, shifted uneasily. Ruth clocked it, the way he looked at Elijah like he recognized himself 10 years ago. But he said nothing. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Sanderson said. But it already was. It always was. Elijah stood up now. His hands were shaking, but his chin was raised. I don't have anything to hide, he said. But why do you keep following me when you already know there's nothing there? Sanderson's response was bureaucratic. Just being thorough. Ruth nearly laughed. You weren't this thorough with that white boy who forgot his laptop at security. I watched you let him go with a warning and a wave. Don't talk to me about it thoroughly. A few passers-by stopped walking. The air thickened. The cafe grew still. Sanderson narrowed her eyes. We can call the police if you don't comply. There it was. The threat is always waiting behind the clipboard. Ruth exhaled slowly. She looked at Elijah, then back at the two officers. Then call them, she said. And bring your supervisor. I want names, badges, everything. The younger officer hesitated again. His eyes met Ruth's. There was a flicker of recognition, a weary kind of respect. Sanderson, sensing the loss of ground, gestured to the officers to step back. We'll make a note of your noncompliance, she said flatly. You make a note, Ruth replied. I'll make a call. They left. Just like that. But the damage had already deepened. Not just in Elijah, but in every witness who'd seen yet another black child marked as suspicious simply for existing. Ruth sat again. She didn't touch her coffee. Elijah leaned back, staring out the window. His reflection in the glass looked older than it had that morning. You think they'll come back? He asked. Ruth didn't answer. She was already pulling out her phone. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had a purpose. Because the problem wasn't just that they came. The problem was that no one ever expected them to stop. And that, Ruth knew, was the most dangerous silence of all. The moment Ruth and Elijah reached their gate, the silence between them broke, not with words, but with exhaustion. Elijah sank into the corner seat near the window, burying his face into the crook of his arm like he was trying to disappear. Ruth didn't scold him. She knew what it meant to want to vanish when the world kept trying to make you feel like a suspect in your own skin. Overhead, the airport's polished voice called out final boarding calls, flight delays, and group numbers like it was reciting scripture. All around them, life moved on. A toddler cried. A man barked into his phone about quarterly earnings. A woman in a beige trench coat argued with a gate agent about her carry-on bag. Ordinary inconveniences. But Ruth and her son were far from ordinary passengers now. She glanced down at her hands, still trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the aftermath of holding herself together. That's the thing about being a black mother in America. You learn to lock your rage behind your teeth, to smooth the sharp edges of your voice. Because if you don't, they say you're aggressive, belligerent, dangerous. And you know the cost of being seen that way. Mom, Elijah whispered after a while, do you think they're going to be waiting for us when we land? It wasn't paranoia, it was experience talking. Ruth answered carefully. Maybe, but if they are, they'll see the same thing they saw today. A black boy they don't understand, and a mother who won't let him be broken. Elijah didn't respond right away. Then he said, I didn't do anything. I know, Ruth said. You never have to apologize for who you are. That's the thing they'll never teach in school. Minutes passed, slow and thick. Then the boarding announcement came. Elijah stood, his movements stiff. Ruth noticed the glances again, subtle, practiced, the kind that made a person check their bag twice when someone like Elijah walked by. That silent suspicion. She'd grown up watching it follow her brother. She'd watched it kill her cousin. She wasn't about to let it take her son. They boarded in silence. Aisle seats. Economy. The usual. No frills. No favors. But before they could settle, a white man in his late 40s, khaki slacks, Bluetooth headset still hanging from one ear, paused in the aisle and stared. Excuse me, he said, gesturing toward Elijah. I think you're in my seat. Elijah glanced at the ticket in his hand, confused. I'm 21C. That's my seat, the man insisted. Ruth stepped in. No, it's not. He's in the right seat. We checked in together. A flight attendant approached, a forced smile plastered on. Is everything okay? It's just a seat mix-up, the man said quickly. I'm sure they can double-check. The attendant took a moment, looked at both boarding passes, and then back at Ruth and Elijah. Ma'am, she said to Ruth, would you mind just letting him sit and we'll figure it out once everyone's boarded? It wasn't a request. It was a redirect. Ruth stared at the attendant. A part of her wanted to scream. Not just for this moment, but for every moment like it. The presumption. The subtle reinforcement of whose comfort mattered more. Of who should give up and go along. No, Ruth said clearly. My son is in his seat. If there's an issue, check the manifest. The flight attendant faltered. Her smile faded just slightly. The Bluetooth man gave an exasperated sigh and turned away. Elijah didn't move. Ruth stood, arms crossed, until the attendant backed down and murmured a quiet, thank you for your patience, that meant absolutely nothing. When she finally sat, Ruth whispered, that's how it happens, Elijah. Every time. In 1,000 little ways. You don't have to be loud to be loud. You don't have to be wrong to be wronged. He looked at her, that same hurt behind his eyes, but this time, something else too. A slow, dawning fire. Later, mid-flight, as they drifted through clouds, Ruth watched her son lean his head against the window. His reflection, faint in the glass, didn't look like a boy anymore. It looked like a man caught in the middle of history, a generation taught to endure what the previous one refused to pass on. She reached over, took his hand. Baby, she said softly, we're not free yet. But we're not afraid either. Outside, the sun dipped behind a curtain of clouds. Inside that plane, a different kind of storm gathered. And neither of them was ready to land quietly. By the time Ruth and Elijah landed at LaGuardia, the clouds hung low like the city had something it didn't want to say aloud. You could feel the weight in the air, thick with the kind of knowing silence that Black folks carry from terminal to terminal, city to city. The kind of silence born not from peace but from pattern. Elijah followed close behind his mother through the jet bridge, clutching his backpack with both hands. The boy hadn't said much since they left Atlanta. His eyes were sharp now, not wide like before. Something had hardened in him at 30,000 feet, the way it sometimes does when the world insists on showing its teeth too early. The terminal bustled with the typical ballet of arrivals, families reuniting, business travelers hustling for rideshares, toddlers shrieking with jet lag. And yet, even in all that motion, Ruth could feel the pause when she passed certain people. The subtle glances, the hesitation, the slight arch of a security guard's back as they passed. It wasn't new. It was simply Tuesday in America. Their connection wasn't for another 2 hours. Ruth thought about food. About whether Elijah would eat. About whether he could even taste anything with that kind of acid in his throat. They found a spot near Gate C-19, between a Hudson News kiosk and a coffee shop that smelled like overburdened beans and tired workers. Ruth handed Elijah a 20 and told him to get whatever he wanted. He nodded and shuffled toward the counter. She watched him go, and suddenly she was back in her father's office, a girl again, listening to him speak about dignity like it was a sacred cloth you never let them wrinkle. He used to say, they don't have to call you the word for it to sting. It's not in the slur, it's in the shrug. The silence. The seat they don't offer you. Elijah returned with a croissant and a bottle of orange juice. He sat down slowly, peeling the paper back with mechanical care. Ruth waited, letting him take a bite before she asked, "You holding up okay?" He nodded but didn't speak. She knew that nod. It was the nod you gave a teacher who assumed you plagiarized your essay because it was too well written. The nod you gave to a store clerk who followed you down every aisle. The nod of survival. Across from them, a man in a pilot's uniform stared openly. His mouth didn't move, but his eyes said something that made Ruth's skin crawl. She met his gaze until he looked away. Not out of shame, just disinterest. Minutes later, as if summoned by something unseen, 2 airport police officers strolled past. Not in a rush. Not with urgency. Just circling, Ruth knew the choreography. It was the slow dance of intimidation. Keep the presence just close enough to remind you that your skin tone was a variable in every equation. One of the officers, white, mid-40s, with a trim mustache, paused near their row. "Everything okay here?" he asked, voice dipped in something falsely casual. Ruth raised her chin. "Is there a reason it wouldn't be?" The officer smiled tightly. "Just checking in. We've had some reports of, suspicious behavior." Elijah looked up, stunned. "From who?" The officer didn't answer. The dance didn't require facts, only innuendo. Ruth exhaled slowly, each breath measured like she was counting down a fuse. "We've been sitting here quietly. Bought food. Didn't bother anyone. If someone thinks we're suspicious, maybe you should ask what they saw instead of assuming." The officer's partner, black, younger, eyes darting like he didn't want to be there, murmured, "Ma'am, we're just following up." Ruth stood. That act alone shifted the energy. "You want my ID?" she asked coolly. "You want to check my boarding pass? You want to see my degrees? My son's transcript? You let me know what proof you need today to let a black mother and her boy sit in peace." The younger officer flinched. The older one said nothing. And still, there it was again. That invisible war. Fought not with bullets, but with questions. With glances. With patrols disguised as politeness. Elijah sat still, like he was trying not to breathe too loudly. A white woman sitting 2 rows behind them leaned over. "Excuse me," she called to the officers. "They've been sitting there for nearly 30 minutes. Quietly. Maybe you should talk to whoever's reporting fake threats instead of harassing travelers." The officers exchanged a glance. That unexpected voice threw off their rhythm. The older one mumbled something about protocol and backed off. When they were gone, Ruth exhaled again. That, she said to Elijah, was strike 2. He looked at her, frowning. "What's strike 3? She didn't answer. But they both knew. Strike 3 is when you stop asking questions and start handcuffing. Strike 3 is the mistake that's not a mistake. Strike 3 is what her father never stopped warning her about, and what she now had to teach her son in real time. The flight would leave in another hour. But they'd already traveled through the underbelly of America's airport logic, the unspoken belief that melanin and malice must be cousins. And Ruth knew this was only the middle of the story. Because in America, the turbulence always starts before takeoff. The terminal buzzed with the indistinct hum of flight announcements and human motion. Gate C-19 had become a kind of purgatory, an in-between space where time thickened and tensions brewed, unspoken but undeniable. Ruth sat beside Elijah, her hands folded tightly in her lap, not in prayer, but in preparation. She had been here before. Not this gate, not this airport, but this feeling, the slow boil of being watched, evaluated, diminished. It was a ritual in America. Not carved into law, not always loud, but persistent. A black woman learns to read rooms the way a sailor reads the wind, quiet shifts in direction, subtle cues of danger. And that day, the wind was changing. A new officer walked past them now. Young, pale-skinned, nervous in his posture. He didn't stop. Just glanced sideways. Ruth didn't need to ask Elijah if he saw it. The boy had grown quiet again, watching the floor, his fingers tracing the corner of his novel like he was searching for balance. Then the loudspeaker crackled. "This is the final boarding call for Flight 737 to San Francisco. All passengers, please proceed to Gate C-21. Ruth stood. Elijah followed. They approached the gate. The agent behind the desk, tight blonde bun, weary smile, name tag read D. Whitaker, scanned their boarding passes. The moment the scanner beeps red, Ruth's breath is caught. "I'm sorry," the agent said, looking at her screen. "There's a flag on your boarding pass. I'll need to check with security." Ruth blinked slowly, willing her voice to stay level. "What kind of flag?" The woman looked uncomfortable. "It doesn't say. Just that you're required to wait for a secondary screening before boarding." They stood there, mother and son, frozen like a photograph of history repeating itself. "Call your supervisor," Ruth said quietly. The agent hesitated, then nodded, picked up the phone, and spoke in code that Ruth recognized, phrases like Section 12 protocol and random check override. Nothing random about it. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Passengers continued to board the plane while Ruth and Elijah waited like ghosts outside a door that wouldn't open. Finally, a man in a blazer and a practiced smile appeared. His name tag read V. Reynolds, airline supervisor. His face bore the mask of corporate diversity training, a pleasant expression that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Miss Campbell," he began, voice low. "We just need to do a quick check on your son's ID and boarding information. Routine verification, that's all." "Routine," Ruth repeated. "Why him?" Reynolds tilted his head. "I assure you, this is standard." "Then show me the policy," she replied. "Because I've flown enough to know that the standard doesn't look like this. It doesn't look like a black child pulled from a flight line because he's tall, quiet, and has brown skin." Reynolds' eyes flicked toward a nearby TSA officer. He gestured discreetly, and 2 men in uniform approached. No one was shouting. No one needed to. The performance was in silence, in the assumption of guilt without a word spoken. Elijah's voice broke through. "Mom." Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained like steel. "It's okay. We'll stand right here, and they can search whatever they want. But we're not going into any back room. Not again." The TSA officer frowned. "Ma'am, we're trying to ensure a safe flight for all passengers." "And what exactly makes us unsafe?" she asked. "The fact that we survived your harassment 2 days ago? The fact that your own test came back clean? Or is it just the wrong kind of face in the wrong kind of place?" A silence fell over the terminal. Other passengers began to notice. Some looked away, embarrassed. Some took out phones. One woman whispered to her partner, "Didn't I see them in the news?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "Let's not escalate this." "You already did," Ruth said. "You escalated at the moment you pulled my son out of line without cause." The agent at the gate looked trapped. Reynolds seemed suddenly unsure. But Ruth wasn't. She turned to Elijah, her voice gentle. "You still want to get on this plane?" He nodded. "Barely." "All right then," she said to the officers. "Search the bag. Right here. In front of everyone." They didn't like it, but they knew better. In full view of travelers and blinking phones, the officers opened Elijah's backpack again. Book, charger, jacket. No pouch this time. No powder. No pretense. When they finished, Ruth waited. "Well?" The older officer, face now red, muttered, "You're clear." "No apology?" she asked. He said nothing. Reynolds stepped in. "Let's get you both on board." As they walked down the jet bridge, Ruth glanced back once. The woman at the gate wouldn't meet her eyes. The officers were already moving on. But the crowd, some in the crowd, watched with something else. Recognition. Not guilt. No pity. Just a flicker of understanding. That this shadow dance of dignity and suspicion was a familiar tune played too often in too many keys. Inside the plane, Elijah slid into his seat, pressed his head against the window, and closed his eyes. Ruth sat beside him, heart still racing. She didn't speak for a long time, because she knew this wasn't the end. You don't dismantle an old lie in one flight. Not even in 1,000. But you speak. You stand. You make them search you in front of everyone. Because the only thing more dangerous than injustice is when we stop insisting it exists. The plane touched down with a shudder, rubber screaming softly against the Atlanta tarmac, and the applause was half-hearted, scattered. Ruth didn't move. Her hands were clasped in her lap, unmoved by the minor miracle of flight. Elijah exhaled beside her, eyes still distant, staring through the oval window as if hoping the view might shift into something more forgiving. They had made it home. But home, Ruth had long understood, was not just a matter of geography. It was a matter of welcome. And sometimes, a place wore your presence like an uncomfortable coat, tolerated but never quite fitting right. As they rose with the rest of the passengers and shuffled into the narrow aisle, Ruth felt it again, that subtle, familiar shifting of energy. The sidelong glance, the tight-lipped smile, the nervous tension that spread from one face to another like a contagion no one spoke of aloud. It was quiet. Too quiet. At the terminal exit, 2 airport staff members waited with clipboards and tight expressions. Not TSA. Not the police. Not security. Administrative. The kind that wore badges and language that sounded official but always lacked the warmth of humanity. "Ms. Campbell?" one asked, his voice wrapped in fake courtesy. Ruth didn't answer. She looked at Elijah, who nodded faintly. The man continued. "We've been asked to escort you to the customer relations office. Just a brief follow-up, nothing urgent." Ruth's lips curled into a near smile. "Follow-up from what?" The man didn't blink. "We'd just like to hear more about your travel experience." It was a lie. But the kind of lie this country has refined into ritual. "We just want to talk." No threat. No handcuffs. Just pressure. Polished. They followed in silence. The office was glass-walled, strategically placed near the baggage claim. A room meant to look transparent, accountable. But everyone on the inside knew it worked the other way around. It was a container. You didn't feel seen. You felt watched. A woman waited inside. Early 50s. Press suit, pearl earrings, smile so strained it was practically audible. "Miss Campbell." "Elijah." "Thank you for coming. I'm Audrey McIntyre, Community Liaison and Public Outreach for the Atlanta Airport Authority." She gestured for them to sit. Ruth did not. Neither did Elijah. "We're gathering information," Audrey said, folding her hands. "About last week's incident." "I understand emotions run high." Ruth chuckled. "Just once." Sharp, dry. "You call it an incident. We call it Tuesday." Audrey flinched but recovered. "We want to ensure all passengers feel safe and respected." "Is that what you were doing?" Ruth asked, her voice even, "when your people grabbed my son in front of strangers? When they rummaged through his bag like he was a criminal? When you held him without cause twice?" Audrey offered the corporate version of concern. "It's our goal to make sure nothing like that happens again." Ruth leaned forward. "Your goal," she said slowly, "was to make sure no one complained loud enough to reach the press. But you didn't count on me being the kind of mother who was raised by a man who marched with Dr. King, a woman who watched a church burn when she was 6, a girl who learned real early that if you don't speak, they'll bury you in silence." Audrey sighed. "I understand your frustration." "No," Ruth said. "You understand your liability. There's a difference." Elijah remained quiet, but his eyes moved from one adult to another. He was studying something deeper now, not just power, but performance. He saw how the woman measured her words like currency. How Ruth stood tall, though exhaustion hung from her shoulders like a second coat. Audrey's next words were clipped. "We've launched an internal review." Ruth nodded. "Have you launched one into how many Black families are flagged for extra searches? Or why does the phrase random check seem to mean check them?" The room tightened. Ruth didn't wait for a reply. "Because if you haven't," she continued, "then this isn't an apology. It's public relations." There it was again, that tension. Not loud, not spoken, just sitting in the air like humidity before a southern storm. The woman stood finally. "We'll be in touch. And we hope you'll consider joining our passenger advisory panel." Ruth laughed. "Truly this time. You want me to help you fix the problem you caused." Audrey tried to recover. "We value your voice." "Good," Ruth said. "Because you're going to be hearing a lot more of it." They left the glass office and stepped back into the bustle of the airport. Baggage claim was still crowded. People waiting, yawning, shifting weight from foot to foot. But the Campbell family stood still. A man nearby whispered to his wife, pointing discreetly. "That's the woman from the video." Another smiled and nodded at Ruth. Elijah noticed. "They recognize us," he said. Ruth's voice was soft. "Then maybe they'll remember us." The walk to the car was slow. Outside, the sky had clouded. Thunder in the distance. Ruth looked up, then back down at Elijah. "You hungry?" He nodded. "Good. Let's go eat. Because the fight's not over. And you don't go into battle on an empty stomach." Behind them, the airport glowed like a monument, pristine on the outside, trembling underneath. And somewhere within those glass walls, someone was already trying to draft a statement that sounded like justice, but still left the truth untouched. But Ruth wasn't done. Not yet. She had more than luggage to carry. She had a story. And she wasn't going to let anyone pack it away. Ruth Campbell stood before the school board meeting that Thursday evening, not as an invited speaker, not even as a scheduled parent on the docket. She stood because silence had failed her too many times before. And this time, it was her son's name being whispered in the margins of white papers and office doors. Elijah Campbell, a disruption, Elijah Campbell, under review. There had been no incident, not really. Just a rumor passed from one tight-lipped teacher to another. Elijah had raised a question in history class, a simple, pointed question about redlining, about the difference between post-war housing policies and the neighborhoods his grandparents were denied access to. The teacher had stumbled, stammered, and asked him to refrain from politicizing the lesson. 2 days later, a note came home suggesting Elijah be evaluated for behavioral defiance. It was a careful word, defiance. Not aggression. Not violence. Just enough to mark him. Just enough to trigger the protocols, extra eyes in the hallway, meetings without invitations, whispered concerns in staff lounges thick with coffee steam and quiet prejudice. Ruth had seen it before. In that sterile school boardroom, fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale glow, white walls, white chairs, white men in blue blazers. She cleared her throat. "My name is Ruth Campbell," she began. "I'm here about my son." No one interrupted. Yet the tension was palpable, thin-lipped administrators shifting in their chairs, eyebrows rising ever so slightly, pens poised but not writing. Ruth's voice remained steady. "Your teachers flagged Elijah for asking a question. Not cursing. Not threatening. A question. About American history. About facts that exist in books, in court cases, in neighborhoods still divided by invisible fences." She paused. Her gaze scanned the room. One older woman looked away. A man near the end tapped his pen, agitated. "Let me ask you something," Ruth continued. "What is it about a black child asking a question that scares you?" There was no answer. Only shifting silence. She didn't expect one. She left shortly after, but the board filed notes behind closed doors, already working on the right language to dismiss the complaint without sounding dismissive. That same week, Elijah's bus route changed without notice. He was told to wait at a new stop, farther from home, near the edge of an industrial area. Ruth noticed the difference immediately. When she called transportation services, the clerk on the other end acted surprised. "It's just an administrative oversight," they said. But Ruth knew what a pattern looked like. First they isolate you. Then they mislabel you. Then they hope you disappear. At church that Sunday, the Reverend, an old friend of her father's, pulled Ruth aside after service. "I saw the clip of you on the local news," he said, a little amused, a little worried. She offered a weary smile. "I didn't go there for cameras." "I know. But they came anyway." He looked at her, kind but searching. "Are you ready for what happens next?" "I've been ready," she said, "since the first time someone asked me where I was really from." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Then may your voice be louder than their silence." But that was the thing, Ruth thought later. The silence wasn't always loud. Sometimes it crept. It came as cold courtesy, as emails without warmth, as security officers who smiled too long before asking to see your ID again. And it showed up again that Tuesday when Ruth and Elijah stopped for lunch at a small sandwich shop in downtown Atlanta. The cashier's smile faltered when they walked in. The man ahead of them had paid with a $50 bill, no issue. But when Ruth offered the same, the cashier squinted at it, held it up to the light, and called for a manager. "You understand," he said. "Policy." "No," Ruth replied. "I understand bias, dressed up as policy." Elijah looked down, his shoulders rigid. Ruth saw it, that creeping shame that didn't belong to him, but still settled in his bones. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "They want us to believe we're always being watched because we've done something wrong," she said later. "But baby, sometimes they're watching because they can't understand how we're still standing." That night, she wrote again, letters to the school, and a post on social media that caught fire. But what she felt wasn't rage. It was something quieter. Something more dangerous. It was resolve. Because the thing about these small humiliations, these daily paper cuts of race, is they teach you to endure without bleeding in public. They teach you to smile when you want to scream. To walk away when you want to shake the ground with your footsteps. But Ruth had learned something her father had once whispered to her. The world will try to write your story for you. But your voice, if you use it right, can become scripture. At that moment, she looked across the dinner table at her son, who was rereading Invisible Man, and she realized they were already writing a new book, line by line, breath by breath. Not with permission, but with truth. There is a kind of grief, subtle and slow-burning, that seeps into the bones of a people, grief born not from death, but from the constant burden of having to prove one's humanity. Ruth Campbell knew that grief well. She'd worn it like a second skin for most of her life. But on a gray October morning, when the air in Atlanta tasted like steel and the radio crackled warnings of rain, she understood something new, that grief could give way to something sharper, reckoning. It began with a letter. Typed. Cold. Bureaucratic. "We regret to inform you that Elijah Campbell's enrollment at Central Heights High School is being reviewed for behavioral violations and disruption of academic integrity." Ruth read the words once, twice, and then again. Each time they became more surreal. Elijah, who had never been in a fight, never been suspended, who brought home books instead of bruises, was now being described as a risk. Not a student. Not a boy. A risk. She didn't cry. Not this time. The well had dried weeks ago. Instead, she made 3 phone calls, one to the ACLU's education hotline, one to a journalist she once met at a teacher's protest, and one to Pastor Green. By noon, the story was already moving. A respected Black honors student, penalized for speaking his mind, for raising questions that made white teachers uncomfortable. The article didn't shout. It whispered. And in that whisper was a blade. By sunset, her porch was filled with reporters. And by nightfall, it was filled with neighbors. Some brought casseroles, others brought words. And still others brought silence. The same people who had once nodded politely at Ruth in the grocery store now stood behind hedges, watching. Watching what happens when a Black mother refuses to kneel. Elijah didn't want to go to school the next morning. His hands shook as he tried to zip up his jacket. Ruth stood behind him and placed her hands on his shoulders. "The world will tell you to stay small," she said. "But you're not meant to fit into their fears." He nodded, and he walked out the door. At school, his locker had been moved. His desk had been shifted to the far end of the classroom. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. You're not welcome here. Not without silence. In the homeroom, the teacher, Miss Henson, a woman with a smile that never reached her eyes, called out the names. She paused on his. "Elijah Campbell," she said slowly. "I hope you'll stay on task today." He answered only with a look. By lunch, whispers followed him down the hallway. Some kids avoided him. Others asked crude questions they thought were clever. "Why do you always have something to prove? Are you trying to be famous or something?" He didn't answer. Instead, he went to the library, pulled out Between the World and Me, and tried to breathe. But outside the school walls, something larger was happening. The article had gone national. Civil rights lawyers were calling. Parents were organizing. A sit-in was being planned for the district office. Ruth was invited to speak at a community forum held at a local church. She stood on stage, the light soft on her face, and spoke not with anger, but with truth. My son isn't being punished for breaking rules. He's being punished for reminding the system that the rules were never made for him. There was a long silence after that, the kind of silence that breaks open something deep. And then came the standing ovation. But the price of defiance is rarely paid in applause. The next morning, her car had been keyed. A neighbor left an anonymous note in her mailbox. Keep stirring the pot, and don't be surprised when it spills. The school principal requested a friendly meeting. And Elijah came home with slumped shoulders and a bruise on his arm. He refused to explain. Ruth didn't scream. She simply held him and whispered, "They are trying to make you feel alone. But you are never alone. Not while I'm breathing." 2 days later, the school board met. Dozens of parents filled the room, some black, some white, some unsure what side of history they were standing on. The superintendent, a man with a graying mustache and polished shoes, called the meeting to order. He tried to speak in measured tones. But Ruth stood and interrupted. She didn't shout. She spoke. Do you know what it feels like to be criminalized by the very institutions meant to educate you? She pointed to Elijah. That boy is your future. And you're treating him like your threat. The room trembled in silence. And then a hand rose from the back. Another mother. White. Nervous. She stood. Cleared her throat. My son, he told me Elijah helped him pass his English final. Said he was one of the kindest kids he'd ever met. One by one, hands rose. Voices followed. It wasn't a revolution. But there was resistance. Subtle. Fierce. After an hour, the board voted to revoke the disciplinary review. Elijah would stay. His record would remain clean. But Ruth knew the war wasn't over. It never is. Racism doesn't always wear hoods. Sometimes it wears a tie and smiles while racing you. Still, that night, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table writing a college essay, Ruth lit a candle on the windowsill. Not for prayer. For memory. For every child who was made to feel smaller. For every mother who refused to bow. And for the truth Baldwin always knew, that to be black and conscious in America is to live in a constant state of rage, but also, somehow, of hope. Even now,